All right. Happy Sunday morning, everybody. Very excited to welcome Peter Rollins to the program. Hello there, Peter. How are you?
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm doing well. I've followed your work for a while, so it's great to finally have a conversation with you.
Indeed. Likewise, my friend. Likewise. I myself actually come from a kind of split Episcopalian, like lapsed evangelical background. So your work has actually been of certain fundamental importance to me, stretching back many years now. And as I have turned a lot more to Marxism and to socialist politics and things of that nature, the question of Christianity, of course, always remains a sticky one. And Peter, we wanted to. I like to start with big questions, and then we'll get down to the minutia. We're talking today about Pascal, and we'll elaborate who Pascal is, why he's important for Lacan. I want to understand why he's important for you, but let me actually first start, because Lacan says something about Pascal, that it is his conception of grace that is so essential for psychoanalysis to understand. How do you theorize grace? I've always wanted to ask you that question. Like, how does it work for you? Is there a certain formula that you have thought about? What actually is grace for in your theological conception?
Yeah, and this will definitely obviously connect with the Pascalian reading. I'll say something outside of that for a second. I think what Lacan does with grace is very interesting, because the experience, if the theological idea of grace, which I see as fundamentally anti-self-help, self-help is always about how do I get from A to B? How do I move from one place to another? I want to write a book. How do I write the book? I want to get a partner. How do I get a partner? And self-help kind of, gives you advice of how to get from A to B. Grace is this idea that, you are accepted. You don't have to do anything. It's an experience that is pure gift. There's no economy to it at all. And one of the ways I think of grace is, if self-help is moving from A to B, grace is the experience of staying at A and realizing that A does not equal A, which means that it's a space where you encounter your own self and your own self-division in a place of radical acceptance. So that's kind of one of the interesting things about grace. And I've been doing a little bit of work with grace in terms of a book that I'm currently writing. But in terms of what Lacan is doing with Pascal, there's a really interesting sense in which this notion of grace is, Adrian Johnson talks about this, a sublimation of the infant's experience before the mother other, the other's desire, that they're completely at the behest of the other. They are weak, they're powerless, they will literally die if the other doesn't look after them. And in one sense, grace could be the experience of this enigmatic desire alighting upon you and not knowing why. What does the other desire? Why do they desire me? What can I do? There's nothing you can do. So I'm very interested in how kind of Lacan looks at this Pascalian notion of grace as actually a very primordial experience of the infant in relation to the other's desire.
Yeah, well said. In a certain way, there's also a pernicious side of grace, is there not? Mm-hmm. In the sense that grace, as we know, say from Max Weber, is born, or is rather, capitalism throws grace into some kind of chaos, some kind of question. And this is sort of a class issue, like grace as who has it, who doesn't, mm-hmm. becomes the question. What does that mean in the modern period? In the sense that, like, do you think about it that way? You know what I'm saying? Because, or are we like grace as the ideological tools of a ruling class? Because Pascalianism and Jansenism, this very interesting, almost defenders of St. Augustine's theory of predestination, which was seeking to preserve a conception of God that was of the Old Testament, that's not content to accept a reconciled, rationalist, Cartesian version of God, a watered down God, but wanting to retain something of a God of faith, right? Well, what Lacan would call the God of the real, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and so on. And in order to do that, for the damned, for those who do not have grace, their situation is interesting in the sense that what does it mean to not have grace? Maybe one question for you, and not only for Pascal, but like, is there still a kind of political ideological power to this conception of grace? Because we know what capitalism does with class, and how the ruling class always requires an ideology for its destiny, for its implanting of its project. Does it still work that way for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I think of grace and predestination, both of which are, very intertwined. So basically, the notion of predestination, for anybody who doesn't know their theology, is like, you're predestined to salvation or damnation, and there's not a thing you can do about it. And it's kind of grace because it's not economic. You can't will it. You can't believe into it. You can't do anything. You're either screwed or you're saved. And in some respects, this has been seen as very negative, especially within progressive theological circles. They don't really like this notion of predestination. However, what's interesting about it is that actually, if there's nothing you can do to get salvation, literally nothing you can do, and you don't ever know for sure whether you're saved or damned. You can't ever know for sure. There's a little bit of fear and trembling always in it. You can never know whether you've been bestowed with divine favor, with grace. So what this means is there's no economic dimension to your ethical being, right? Because you can't influence God, you can't kind of make God love you or do anything. You either are an asshole or you're not. In terms of yourself, you kind of have to take responsibility, and that's not a million miles away from the Kantian non-pathological ethics, where you kind of do the good for no other reason than it's because it's the good. So there's something about predestination that I think is very emancipatory in a way, because I think there's something about it that robs kind of moral life of a certain economic consideration that I find kind of very, very interesting. So anyway, that's kind of the positive side of predestination and grace, is because there's no working. And this is why the Jansenists were like Calvinists in a way. They were like, there's no sense in which you can twist God's arm. And Pascal himself, Pensée is not about twisting God's arm, which we'll get to in a little bit, but there's nothing you can do. And so in a way, you just have to take responsibility for who you are.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, predestination is not determined by one's merits.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Calvinist milieu, in the American ideology, I think, as Weber would put forward, well, actually, no, it would be determined by your good works. So that distinction, or rather, God's imminent judgment on one's grace or not having grace with God. Now, you said that in today's, I don't know if postmodern is the right word, but in today's marketplace, grace. Could you say something more about this? Grace is something which almost doesn't even have a logic. Well, you said something about self-help. Can you tease that out a little bit more, exactly what you mean by that? Like, how exactly do you approach it? And actually, could you also say something maybe for listeners that have no real bearing on your thought? Peter is known, by the way, as a kind of anti-religious Christian, as a Christian who has redefined the meaning of Christian atheism. And in in that context, how actually does grace work for you? Could you say a little bit more about that now that you've elaborated some of it historically and for Pascal and so on? Very curious
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, in one respect, again, kind of, I've got Lacan in the back of my head, Seminar 16. I think there's something really interesting about the idea of grace being actually quite disturbing. This idea of being completely powerless in relation to a godlike other who can bestow their favor on you or not in a way that you don't actually know how to get that or what to do with that. And that will get us to, Pascal's wager. But more generally, someone like Paul Tillich, he talks about grace as the acceptance that you're accepted. And in a way, this is very connected to psychoanalysis for me. Again, is like in our culture where advice is given, counseling, even therapy is about often being giving the person good advice, almost like someone's got a broken arm, and if you just put it in the right cast, it will want to get better. And in the same way, I want to be in healthy relationships. I want to be in a healthier work environment. I just need the right advice. And if I get the right advice and the right care, then maybe I say I will get out of the bad relationship. And of course, psychoanalysis is kind of the idea that no, we often don't want our own well-being. We don't want good advice. In fact, advice is always super simple. Like all the advice about how to write a book and stuff like that is super easy. You don't have to, spend a lot of money. It's like write 500 words a day. The problem is you don't do it. What enjoyment are you getting out of not doing it? Now, what I think grace does is instead of giving you advice of how to get from A to B, how to write the book, for example, what you do is you sit and you go, what enjoyment am I getting out of not writing the book? What enjoyment am I getting out of having my mind going blank? Am I not speaking because I'm protesting against something I don't want to speak, or I never felt I could speak when I was young, or whatever it is? That, in a sense, instead of trying to move from A to B, you stay at A, you radically accept yourself. And in that, you start to see your own enjoyment, your own disavowed or repressed enjoyments. This is the dimension of grace that I think has emancipatory potential. And yeah, very interested in that dimension.
Yeah, because in a certain way, what Lacan says about Pascal is that Pascal, the novelty, the originality of Pascal in the history of thought, right? It has to be understood as linked to a historical moment of what Lacan calls the absolutization of the market, which means that Pascal, 16th century thinker, 17th century thinker, emerges at a time in which capitalism in its early formation begins to really become concrete. Not, of course, industrial capitalism as we know it from, say, the 1820s till now, but this idea that the market began to enter into domains of pleasure in ways that actually disturbed not only science. I mean, science and rationality is another dimension to this. That's a huge important one, but it's also this market creep. And in a way, what I think Lacan is saying is that Pascal has to respond to the new reality of how, because he situates Pascal in the lineage of Aristotle as a commentator on pleasure, right? And he says that Aristotle has this notion that pleasure is this kind of homeostatic idea of coming into a kind of harmonious relationship to pleasure qua the virtues and leading a life of the golden mean and things of that nature, trying to achieve the wholeness, the goodness. But Pascal, because he's experiencing early capitalism, understands pleasure as a necessary site of renunciation. On the one hand, on the other hand, he says that Pascal understood that God was actually being annihilated or killed as a result of what he calls surplus jouissance. In other words, Lacan says at a certain moment, capitalism, while it has this notion of surplus value that we get from Marx, also has this notion of surplus jouissance, and that capitalism allows us to measure, to quantify enjoyment. It's at that moment in European society that Pascal emerges, and that's, he says, what his novelty is. Which I found that a very compelling case. But like all things in Lacan, he doesn't really elaborate it. He kind of hints at it, and then it's up to Lacanian scholars, I think, to further it, tease it out. So, first off, before we jump into sort of who Pascal is, and as a theologian, what do you find? Because you focus mostly on Protestantism, and obviously Pascal is coming here from a very, very peculiar Catholic position. What do you find of interest in Pascal in general? Before we dig in.
Yeah, so there's a number of things I find fascinating about Pascal. He's a very Protestant Catholic, in this predestination, grace, these kind of notions. So the first thing I guess is important. That's why I'm in the tradition of radical theology. And radical theology, in a nutshell, for anybody who's listening, the way I describe the difference between, say, confessional theology and radical theology is radical theology is very oriented around lack. So in mysticism, God is the signifier. So in mysticism, God is a signifier of that which cannot be signified, right? That is a traditional theistic notion of God. Anselm has it. God is that which is beyond signification. So and his argument in a nutshell is God is that than which none greater can be conceived. If you can conceive of God, then you can conceive of something greater than God, which is something that cannot be conceived. And so therefore you can conceive of something greater than God, which is an oxymoron. So he says God must be greater than conception. So in mysticism, mystical experience is the encounter with a saturated phenomenon where the Kantian categories of quantity, quality, modality, relationality are all subverted. You basically are blown away by this excess. Radical theology comes along to say, in a sense, that religious experience is an experience of radical absence, of a type of lack. Paul Tillich, who was not a radical theologian because he had a substantive notion of God, but for him, the religious experience wasn't something that individuals had on a mountaintop or occasionally at some point in their life, or they take DMT or whatever. But religious experience was the experience of ultimate concern. That a philosopher is ultimately concerned with truth. They never have truth. Truth is, in a sense, a type of absence. This is very Derridean in a way. There's a promise, there's a to come. You're in the truth, but you cannot grasp it. The artist is in beauty, but they always fail to paint it. And the lawyer wants to stand on justice, but they never fail to write it. So there's this sense in which you don't get something, and that's universal. We all have universal ultimate concern. So in a similar way, what you see with Pascal is this movement to an absent God, from some sort of hyper-present God or present or hyper-present divine to a type of hidden God. As a book you mentioned to me, Lucien Goldman, The Hidden God, that there's this notion of a radical absence. But also in Pascal, very quickly, his contradictions, the contradictory nature of his work is fantastic. I think he has a prototype of notion of the symptom. So for Pascal, he famously has three orders, and this is how I think this is how the pensée would have been structured potentially, or should have been structured if he had lived long enough. Again, for anybody who doesn't know Pascal, these are fragments of writings that never became the book. Really, it's an apologetic work. But he has the order of the body, the order of the mind, and the order of the heart. And just to look at the first two very quickly, the order of the body, he says that we long for satisfaction, but life gives us nothing but dissatisfaction. So there's your contradiction, right? The reality of dissatisfaction, the hope of satisfaction, and then the symptomatic compromise formation is distraction. We distract ourselves by what his favorite example is, the hunt, but like by various things, we distract ourselves from the despair of never being fully satisfied. And he's brilliant at that. Like Pascal is incredible at painting a tragic vision of human life as one of suffering and despair, and how we hide that despair in distraction and divertisement. And and so at that level, what he wants the reader to do is he wants the reader to want Christianity to be true. He doesn't, that's all he wants. He wants people to want God to exist. And so he goes, so if he gets to that stage, then the second stage is the order of the mind. And the order of the mind is the intellectual life. And basically we want certainty, and the reality is we don't have it about the metaphysical questions. We want answers, and yet we can't have them. And the compromise formation in some respects is probabilities. And at that level, he wants you to go, oh, Christianity might be true. It's possible that it's true. And that's then when he gets to the wager. But what he's doing in all of these contradictions is he's saying something incredible about the human condition, about our desires, about the struggles of existence. And again, that's something that I obviously love about Pascal. And of course, I'll say the final thing, which is the proto-existentialism. You know, there's the wager as this idea that we have to take responsibility for our lives. Is very important. I agree with Lacan, but that I think we have to make the opposite wager to Pascal. But we can get into that in a second.
Oh yeah, I want to hear what you mean by that. That's incredible. Thank you for that summary of the pensée. And there's only 3 pages that the wager is elaborated, but everyone. I was just reading Leszek Kołakowski's "God Owes Us Nothing," which is probably one of the finest works on both. It's called the subtitle is called Pascal's Sad Religion, and it's a beautiful study by a kind of Marxist humanist who was a compatriot of this other figure you mentioned earlier, Lucien Goldmann. Because you see, in the background of Lacan Seminar 16 is a commentary on the bureaucratization of Marxism during the time of Stalinism, in fact, and that Goldmann, who was a partisan of, you could say, Stalinism, although he was definitely critical of Stalinism. He wasn't a Stalinist, but he was, let's say, a Marxist in a true sense. Lacan begins multiple references of a strong critique against Goldmann. And we've been studying, Peter, in our study group, because we're so interested in the sort of meaning of Marxism today. What does Lacan actually say about Goldmann? And one of the things he says is something about truth, about the righteousness of truth. So on the one hand, he offers a critique of what he will call in Seminar 17 a kind of proto-worldview orientation. I found that interesting also, Peter, because you have a critique of what you call worldview Christianity. This idea that Marxism or Christianity or any ism is embodied in a Weltanschauung. That the truths of that community have a kind of transitive quality, or that because that's the question, is that the dogma. Lacan is concerned about Marxism becoming a dogmatic enterprise, and he thinks that when Marxism becomes a dogmatic enterprise, this is the key point where he thinks he can teach something to Marxism, because he's not anti-Marxist. He's maybe critical, okay? Is that they miss out on pleasure. They miss out on the truths of pleasure, because he wrote he delivered the Seminar of 16 right at 68, when 68 happened. So the student uprising is happening, and he's saying to Goldmann and other Marxist priests, he calls them priests, that they don't understand how enjoyment is codifying and attaching to the speech of the protesters. So it's a very, I think, provocative, almost Lacan could almost be understood as like a jester to the Marxist. You know what I'm saying? Saying, I know something about pleasure that you guys don't know.
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if how you think about that, and what your thoughts are on this notion of the Weltanschauung and truth for Christianity, but also perhaps even for Marxism, if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, then kind of connecting even deeper with radical theology, where I think theology becomes radical is whenever you see a type of lack or division or asymmetry woven into the very fabric of the absolute itself, in the very fabric of reality, what I call the unknowing God, not the unknown God, but the God who, in a sense, has unknowing or spontaneity, novelty, not at oneness within it. And for me, that is the truth. That is the Hegelian absolute knowledge. Is, today in the political scene, you have people who associate on the right, who talk about universal positives, meritocracy, justice, the idea of equality. That's the watchword of the right, right? Okay, we should have ideally blind institutions that treat everybody the same. Then you have people who associate themselves, call themselves on the left, kind of liberal left, who say that there are no positive universals. Positive universals are just disguised particularities that help one group of people over another. And the watchword there is equity. Equity, obviously giving different people different things depending on what they need. And what you have is different communities intersecting with each other. What I think is interesting is, and this is what I call the distinction between community and communion, is a community for me is based around identity. So on the right, you've got identitarianism. On the so-called left today, you have identity politics. I think their identity. What I'm interested in is the idea that there is a universal, but the universal is negativity itself, that we are all joined together by desire, and desire is lack, and by language, and obviously language encompasses lack. Even the look and speech all encompasses a loss and a lack. And a communion is a group of people gathered together around a shared loss, not a shared set of identities, but a shared loss, because communion is a meal around the death of God. The death of God is the shorthand for me for a fundamental lack that is woven into everything. So that's what I mean by truth. But I think that's anti-ideological, because I think ideology at its heart is always covering over the lack, making it into loss, making it contingent, creating scapegoats, saying that we can have unity, oneness, wholeness, if only we get rid of X or Y people, So for me, that's what I mean by, so there is a belief in a sense, or there is a communion, there is a gathering around a shared lack. There is, basically, I talk about the hysterical God. The God is hysterical, as in God is not at one with God. And that's the central insight for me of Christianity proper, is not that we are alienated from God, and Zizek obviously is brilliant on this. It was not that we're alienated from the absolute, but the absolute is alienated from itself. And when we encounter that alienation within the absolute, there is a salvatory dimension to that.
That's very, very, very helpful. Now you say that, and I will have to have you back on to make that case further and develop this further. But I want to now turn to the wager.
Yes.
Which is, okay. I suppose, Peter, one way to get at this is the question of if God, in Pascal's vision, cannot be handled by reason, but by faith alone. Pascal is sort of saying to, and this is an interesting historical side point, is he's saying to the libertines around him, because you see there was a certain crisis around St. Augustine's teachings at the time that was leading a lot of people to be branded as heretics. And the whole ideological system of the church was in a certain chaos. So Pascal's trying to restore order in a certain way. And he's giving various options for people, even if they are atheist, even if they are agnostic, or even if they already believe. He's sort of saying that in all instances, however you approach the question whether God exists or not, you're gambling. It's a kind of thought experiment that it is a gamble. And Lacan says what Pascal means by that is that the gamble is inevitable. The gamble is already, we all are inducted into it. Why? Because in a certain sense, God is, according to Lacan's reading of Pascal, bound up with language, bound up with the utterance of what Lacan calls the speaking being. So God is an expression of the I. So Lacan will actually say what Pascal is talking about with the wager is not really to be understood about whether God really exists or really not. No, that's actually already established. Like we said, it's the Old Testament God. The God is. That's not really in our purview. Lacan says, actually, no, Pascal's wager is more interesting because it's about whether the I exists. But perhaps we could take a slight step back and maybe you could say a little bit more about giving people a sense of sort of what Pascal means
Oh
with
yeah.
the wager. Yeah,
I'd love to
if you
do
would.
that. And then and that's a great way then to contrast what I think then Lacan does with the wager. So when I mentioned earlier the order of the body, where basically Pascal wants the reader to realize their despair, that they are in a form of despair, and that they distract themselves. And the wealthier you are, the more distractions you can have. But ultimately, that's all we're doing. So he kind of wants the reader to go, oh, I wish God existed. And then at the level of the order of the mind, he interestingly tries to show that Christianity is at least possible. Not God, the existence of God so much, but he talks about like miracles and prophecies and the testimony of the ages to at least make you go, oh, maybe it's possible. And then this is his way of setting up the wager, where now he says, well, if you'd like it to be true, and hey, it's possible it's true, then what should you do? And he says, well, wager. There's two choices: God exists or God doesn't. And you wager on God existing, and if you're right, now this is the key, and it's always very subtle. Is that it's Pascal doesn't think that this gets you saved. He doesn't think the wager does anything. And he says at one point in a great fragment, there are only two reasonable people in the world. And you can translate this in a couple of different ways, but one of the ways is those who search for God with all their heart because they do not know him, and those who seek God with all their hearts because they do. But there's a sense in which even the ones who have found God must continue to seek God. So you have to continue to wager. So you wager, and even if God doesn't show up and you don't get grace and all of that, you're still reasonable. So, hey, that's great. Be reasonable. And if you're lucky, and the order of the heart for Pascal is technically an order that gives you the certainty that the order of the mind doesn't give you, and gives you the pleasure that the order of the body doesn't give you. So there's a certain knowledge that the heart knows that the mind does not, but it's still a knowledge that is riven with uncertainty. You can never quite know if you're saved. Now, so Pascal's wager is this idea of almost becoming receptive. Look at what people do who say that they know God, prayer, fasting, going to church, doing charitable works. And he just says, wager on it, give your life to this. And I say not so much because that is belief or even that will make you believe, but just that's the reasonable thing to do. Now, yeah, I don't know whether to go into then Lacan's reading of this or what Lacan says, because in one sense, what I think is brilliant about this is if you take out the religious dimension and you go, this is an incredible way of describing the infant's encounter with the das Ding of the mother other. Is it because in a sense, just very briefly, I almost say you could talk about God at the register of the imaginary, God at the level of the symbolic, and God of the real. God of the imaginary is, you could imagine, superstition. Gods who are like us, like Zeus in heaven, and there's a lot of that in the Bible. God who gets jealous and is just a little bit like us. Then there's the symbolic God, God the Father, Lacan talks about, which is the God of the law, the God of authority who gives us, covenants and all of that. But then the God of the real, which is maybe Eckhart's Godhead, is the das Ding, is this experience of a radical being gazed upon by that which you cannot know, even if it exists or not. This kind of like feeling utterly responsible and utterly under the gaze of something utterly ineffable that cannot be rendered present at all. And going like that, in a sense, is this experience when we encounter the desire of the mother other, is that there is this ineffable, what do they want of me? And there's this desire for grace, that there's a complete unknowing dimension. It's quite terrifying. And so in some sense, you can read Pascal's wager as a really good description of this experience we all have in relation to the other, with the exception of, say, autism.
Yeah, That's very true, because in a certain way, and I love Richard Boothby and Adrian Johnston and Lorenzo Chiesa's work on Lacanian theology. It's been very influential for my understanding of these. I mean, first of all, I think that a lot of theologians probably feel intimidated by Lacan, in terms of actually plumbing the depths of what he really could contribute.
Mhm.
Since you read a lot of theology, Peter, how is Lacan generally treated in theology? Is there like a kind of well, I know we have, uh, the Milbank-Zizek debate, and Zizek himself has popularized Lacan in theology. But is there a kind of widespread or semi-widespread appreciation for Lacan in theology and his contributions?
Haha. Well,
No.
so I'm more, this will be more anecdotal because, truth be
Yeah, please.
told, I don't read that much theology. I'm more philosophy, whatever. So slightly anecdotal, but I am in the religious world. And I would say, no, there's not. Like, and I'd say there's a very good reason for that. That actually what Lacan is doing is religionless. It's like confessional Christianity ultimately has a substantive notion of God. Generally, like almost like universally, I would say there is not an institution of the divided God. That's my work, actually. I'm not primarily, although I'm interested in theory, I'm a practitioner at heart, and I'm trying to create a liturgy of Lac, what's called Church of the Contradiction. And I don't think this is being done at all. And I'm also nervous about people who do use Lacan a little bit, but try to get Lacan to fit into an Orthodox Christianity. I don't think he does fit into an Orthodox Christianity. I think, Adrian Johnston's completely right. Like there's this can't happen. But I agree with Boothby and Zizek completely that there is a different way of conceptualizing God or the absolute that Lacan opens up. That's Hegelian Lacanian, which is the idea, as I say, of a divided God, a God who is who like I feel as I say, I feel alienated from the divine, so I want to fix that, and then I realize that by the fact that the divine is alienated from itself, I come to terms with my own alienation. It becomes separation. So that theological move, I don't think is being taken seriously at all. And I, for very good reason, I think that the Lacanian position opens up a reformation. And by reformation, I mean a fundamental reinterpretation of the Christian tradition that simultaneously is faithful to it while retroactively transforming it, which is what all reformations do. They weirdly reinterpret everything. So, for example, original sin. I mean, if you can read that as originary lack, and you can say that the church has never embraced original sin. They've embraced original blessing, then there's a fall, and then there's a return. And that just like in most forms of therapy, there's a pre-traumatic subject who falls into trauma and who can kind of get beyond that trauma in some way. Even object relations with Fairbairn, you have a pre-traumatic subject. Maybe the subject has to fall into trauma, right? So the subject has to fall into trauma, but it's still not ontological. Whereas with Lacan, it's an ontological fall. The fall comes first. There's an originary lack. And so again, that's just one example of how I think Lacan helps us to potentially completely reimagine theological terms in a way that is strangely also faithful to them.
Yeah, because I think what you said about the Das Ding, which is a kind of zone which is introduced in the ethics seminar famously, right?
Mm.
Which is a kind of zone of indeterminate desire. It's a kind of zone of opacity, right? An opaque other. And one of the things we said historically that Lacan tries to make that I just want to reiterate, which I find such an important contribution to understanding what Pascal means in the history of thought, is again this idea that capitalism, once it becomes capable of quantifying points of enjoyment, what Lacan will call kind of apparatuses of enjoyment. Lacan says that what Pascal is really saying about the wager is he's making a claim about how one can make the question of God's existence into a cause for their own life, a kind of cause that that is capable of exceeding their own life. And but that doesn't necessarily itself have a bearing on the question of the existence of God in a certain way. It's more about resolving some ailment or splitness of the subject itself, which is why ultimately the wager is about improving the happiness of the subject.
Yes, would you like? I mean, that's the thing. That this is the problem. Is like Lacan, or not Lacan, like Pascal, is brilliant at by experiencing kind of the contradictions of being human. But then, this wager is about kind of resolving all of that in the next life with infinite happiness and all of that. And this is where I think like Lacan is saying that. And Zizek, and there's an article Zizek wrote recently for Everyday Analysis. Is very good on this. That ultimately well, basically, I think Pascal's perverse. Not like there's a perverse structure in this, and my reason for saying that is the pervert is the one who sees themselves as object A for the demand of the other. So the fantasy of the perverse subject is, I am everything for you. I throw myself completely to you, and the other is not desiring so much as demanding the other's demand. So it's not that the other is really lacking in a sense of desire. The other makes demands, and the perverse person wants to be the answer to that demand. For me, Pascal's wager is that he wants to give up his own desire, the worldly desire, object A, and in Seminar 16 is that A is the example of what he's going to give up, in order to be the instrument of God. Now, because Pascal says we don't even know if that's what God wants, like we can't, but literally, and Lacan says this is like Pascal is basically saying that's what God wants. I mean, God wants us to wager. God wants us to wager everything, to give ourselves wholly to the other. And for me, that's kind of like perversion. And actually, what Lacan is saying is what we have to do is we have to resist the wager. We precisely have to do the opposite of wager that God exists, and that we wager that for our own enjoyment at the expense of God. So it's very interesting. I think it's the exact opposite. It's like, and it's so funny because, we think of Pascal as there's two reasonable positions. Either God exists and you wager and you give yourself to God, or God doesn't exist and you don't. But what Zizek says is, well, no, God exists and we wager against God. In other words, the big other exists exists out there in a way, and wants us, we could give ourselves over entirely to the big other and get rid of our desire. But actually, we shouldn't compromise our desire. We should actually hold on to our desire and not get lost in the other absolutely and completely. Because ultimately, the other is divided, right? That's the Lacanian the kind of thing is ultimately the big other is divided, so you cannot fully satisfy the other. So anyway, so that's where I think Pascal, there's a perverse logic. That's why Lacan talks about masochism in Seminar 16.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, which I think is the kind of the purest form of perversion. So
yeah, you're right. And then of course in 17, Lacan will say, and then in later reflections on the so-called fifth discourse of the capitalist discourse, a lot of folks have shown that capitalist discourse, and it's important that the whole novelty of Pascal is owed to this historical materialist change in the market and so on, how object A becomes, how basically the question of God's existence becomes almost like a commodity in a certain way. It comes, and that capitalism kind of kills the transcendental God in a certain way. And Pascal emerges as providing a solution to that. And you're saying that that is perverse. Now, we know in Zizek and others that perversion is kind of very almost like the predominant form of subjectivity. And I wonder if what you make of that, like for a moment, if we might tether with that question, what actually does that mean for you? It's a quite miserable situation, because for the pervert, the das Ding of the other, the opacity of the other, it's not opaque. It's consistent, right?
Yes.
That's against Lacan's point. That's what you're saying, because Lacan's point is no. The big other is opaque.
Yeah.
There is no consistency there. The symbolic order, and that actually goes to Lacan's provocation to Marxism and Christianity as a worldview, because he would want to say that worldviews rely on a clear other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You could
Well,
say
my question would be, why can't you have a worldview that has an inconsistent other?
Yeah. Yes. Oh well. I like that. I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. But we should come back to as well, like, because for me, in one sense, what Pascal is doing potentially is trying to bind his anxiety in the face of the das Ding of the other, this kind of opaque desire that cannot be given form or shape, and his response is to wager, to do all of these things, to kind of like try to I become object A to God, right? To become. That's why I think it's a perverse fantasy. Is Pascal is becoming object A to this das Ding. He's trying to anyway, And for me, that's the kind of perverse fantasy. Is it's funny because perverse subjects rarely go to analysis. So it's funny you're saying like it's a predominant kind of analytic tool for some of the theorists, but there's very little written about it. Stephanie Swales is very, very good on this. She wrote a great book on perversion. So yeah, but that's why I think, so whenever Lacan talks about the perverse fantasy, it looks like the hysterics fantasy a little bit, because the hysteric wants to evoke the desire of the other, but it's different because the pervert wants to plug up the demand of the other. That not kind of evoke the desire of the other, but plug up the demand of the other. And I mean, I'm just reading this into Pascal a little bit, so I'm definitely open to being wrong here. But when I was reading it, especially in relation to coming to this conversation, I was reading it going, oh, I think there's something interestingly perverse. And so I think actually this seminar can help us see what the cure to perversion is, because what I think Lacan is saying in this seminar is the cure to perversion is you have to help the perverse subject to actually make a wager for their own desire, for A, to not give themselves over as an instrument to the other, but to find a way to have a little bit of desire for themselves, which is the perverse subject finds very, very difficult to have any of their own desire. And yeah, so that's how I read this in a way, is in some respects, I read this as a great way. Grace is a great way to understand the experience of the enigmatic other. The God, the hidden God of Pascal, is a great way of understanding the das Ding of the other. And actually what Lacan's wager is, and this is what Adrian Johnson argues, Lacan's wager is the opposite of Pascal's wager ultimately, which is don't give yourself wholly and lose yourself entirely as the answer to the other's desire, because you can't, because the other's divided. That's a fantasy. You'll just end up being miserable. Somehow, how do we help individuals carve out and remain faithful to some dimension of their own desire? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, with Lacan, it's always an interesting question how one takes the clinical insight and then crosses the border into social and cultural application. And I think in this instance, because we know, for example, Antigone is the paradigmatic kind of heroine of the ethics seminar, in which the refusal of compromising on one's desire is the kind of higher maxim that is derived from the seminar. And that has also a clinical implication, in the sense that the idea of das Ding is found in the Anna Lassan's speech when they try to touch upon a region of their unconscious where they say, that's it. That's it. Even though they've brought what they seemingly assume to be the heart of their ailment, their symptom, Lacan says it still remains opaque to them. And so they circle around it, right? Even when you bring the elephant in the room out, it's like that's das Ding. There's still a void, there's still a hole. So this idea of desire as bound up with what Lacan calls the unary trait is also a very, very interesting point, because one of the things we haven't mentioned is that there's this notion of multiple infinities that Lacan works with in Seminar 16. And the notion is basically that when you add, basically Pascal's point, when you add the proposition that if you wager on infinite happy lives, what he calls infinite happy lives, I want your take on this in a certain way. Pascal seems to basically put the achievement or the possible success of that outcome when you gamble on it in the wager, he puts that almost below the possibility of not having a happy life. So it's almost like the reward for the affirmation of God's existence is greater than even the possibility of an infinite happy life. Is that how you read that? Because if that's true, he's also saying this kind of Pavlovian point about belief, if I'm not mistaken, which is basically like the best amongst us begin in a stage of non-knowing and they just believe, they fake it until they make it. Is that kind of what he's saying there? If we could tease that out a little bit. I'm also asking for clarification for myself.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Because this is the bit. I mean, I'll tell you how I read these formulations in Seminar 16, but I don't know if I'm getting it right. So I don't know whether it's similar to what you're saying or different to what you're saying, but I know you're touching on these formulations that are in there, that were basically, he uses object A and gives it a numerical value. And I am so not mathematical, but here's what I get out of this is that when you add A to 1, your life, your 1, you end up with less. That there's there's something of, that what Pascal says is that your enjoyment, like, so in the wager, Pascal says you're going to have to give up some enjoyment if you're going to wager on God, right? You're going to have to pray, you're going to have to go to church, you're going to have to do boring stuff. But then he ultimately says, but here what you'll find out is actually all of that pleasure seeking that you were doing is actually nothing. You're losing nothing at all, right? It's worth nothing. It's worthless. So you end up, you're not actually wagering anything. Now, at the beginning, you think you're wagering something. So you put your ante down and then you discover, oh my goodness, pursuing money and fame and new houses and boats and whatever you want, all of that counts as nothing. And how I read this, as Lacan, is always very, very difficult, but that Lacan is saying that, well, desire is less than nothing. And that's what makes it, that's what makes it so powerful, is that desire is always a form of lack, a form of void. And that's exactly what we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't give up the less than nothing. That's where the enjoyment is.
And he literally calls it less than nothing, which I was like, we were reading it and we're like, oh, this is where Slavoj gets the phrase. I think he maybe doesn't credit it to 16, but I think he even says it there. But
oh, very interesting. Yes. Yeah. So is that connected to what you're talking about, or is that a different point? Because
no, I think this is the heart of the point, which is, I mean, of course, Pascal is I mean, he's making a claim that is trying to defend the existence of the Old Testament God and the kind of static continuity of Christianity. And I suppose he was sort of he was highly successful in a certain way. And Goldman says, of course, that he reads, by the way, we've mentioned this name, Goldman. Let's just say briefly what Goldman says about Pascal. I think it's kind of worth it. Mm-hmm. He basically thinks that Pascalianism is a precursor to existentialism, in the sense that Pascalianism gives a rationale for conceiving of a collective existence as contradiction, as contradictory. But Goldman, and I suppose Goldman would be pushing against perhaps even your position in some sense, Peter, is basically saying, no, that's actually not adequate to Marxism. because Marxism affirms that collective existence can also achieve a break from contradictory existence.
Mhm.
That's what the wager is about for Marxism. In other words, the wager for the proletariat is that their condition can be overcome. Like in the Communist Manifesto, we are nothing, make us all.
Mhm.
So therefore, for Goldman, Pascal's wager is kind of an ingenious ideological device for bourgeoisie. It's a kind of, going back to this notion of the
Yeah.
elect. Now, I don't know what you think of that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
interesting because, of course, there is a certain implicit pessimism. And I think Goldman is right that Marxism, socialism, the left, the meaning of the left, should imbue itself, let's say, with a certain optimism about what collective existence can overcome, what we can achieve, and so on. So he says the wager is about this Hegelian idea that the proletariat can become a vessel of the realization of the absolute.
Mhm.
So perhaps if we, again, take Lacan's insights and your insights, could the realization of the absolute also be contradictory? Can we still, because one could see almost an end of history scenario in which, oh yeah, we never face the true antagonism of, let's say, the immiseration thesis of Marx. I mean, I read Marx as, why is Marx political? Marx is political, in my view, often in his analysis of capitalism because he is concerned with ameliorating the condition of immiseration, right? This unique form of suffering. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
That capitalism produces in a class that it subordinates, that it dominates, that is dominated. So I suppose I'm curious about that for you, to
Yeah.
go back now to sort of tease, because again, Pascal and Marx are the two names that Seminar 16 is working with.
Yeah. Well, if I
How do you understand? How do you understand this? Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, so the way where I think Pascal, where it feels is that, for example, when he talks about the order of the body, that we long for satisfaction and objects that will satisfy, but the reality is objects don't satisfy, and we, as a compromise formation, we find distractions, and but it's basically a life of despair. At its most simple, what Pascal doesn't have yet is he doesn't have a theory of drive, which means he doesn't have a theory that we actually enjoy not having. And one of the very old arguments for the existence of God is called the argument of from desire. And C.S. Lewis famously gave a very clear example of this, that human beings experience all sorts of desires, and those desires can be fulfilled. The desire for food, the desire for water, the desire for intimacy, desire for shelter. And then we also find a desire for something transcendental that cannot be fulfilled. And the argument basically goes, well, hey, if all of our desires that we find in our bodies have an object that will satisfy them, it seems reasonable that this other desire that we find we have also has an object. Now, I think the Freudian response to that is to say, well, that's true, but there's a certain desire we have for desire itself, for a lost object, or for loss as an object. And if basically demand is what the infant does when they cry, they want food. Then desire is, so that's for an object. Desire is for a lost object, like something for the lost oceanic oneness, and we try and get a new car or whatever. And then drive is for loss as an object itself. So if we, at a very broad brushstroke, talk about demand, desire, drive, I'm interested in a religion of drive, which means that God is the name not for that which gets rid of some lack, but rather God is a name for the lack itself. And then I think you can build a political project from this. I think Todd McGowan is really good on this, is that there's a certain sense in which the left, the true left, I think, is a group who get enjoyment through struggle itself, through the embrace of the antagonism, and give themselves over to this antagonism. And that's almost how I would describe communism or whatever is or the next iteration of politics is it possible to directly embrace and enjoy sacrifice, not to get rid of sacrifice, not to get rid of lack, but to directly enjoy it and to directly distribute that sacrifice among everybody. That's the failure of Pascal. What makes him bourgeois? What makes him tragic? Is that he puts this heavenly wholeness in the next life, and this life is just a bit crap. And I just think what he misses is he misses drive, and what we need is a religion of drive. That what Pascal shows confessional religion at its heart, which is it's a religion that God is the object that satisfies lack, not that God is the name for lack itself. Very quickly, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, I think, is a brilliant expression of this in mathematics, where Gödel shows that there is something that is true but not provable within a sufficiently complex mathematical system. So, and an example of this, that a guy, one mathematician, forget his name, Rudy Rickman, I think, says that imagine we have a universal truth machine that can prove anything that is possible to calculate. There's one thing that it won't be able to prove. We write A equals, the universal truth machine will not prove that A is true. We put that into the universal truth machine, and I use A for object A. But so there is a truth that cannot be proved, and in the same way, that's my name for God. God is a truth that cannot be proved, a type of a dimension within reality that is not totalizable, a kind of cut within reality, and there's you can build a political movement on that idea. I think.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you for entertaining my Marxist paranoia, because I do read Lacan as a little bit paranoid, because I think, and a lot of Marxists will come at me and say, why do you care so much about Lacan? My God, because he's so pessimistic about the possibility of proletarian politics and class struggle and things like that. He's trying to shut it down. And my point is, no, like, Marxists need healthy antagonists, to wrestle with. It's on a side point why I think Nietzsche is so essential.
And what do you think about, like, I mean, what do you, like, I always think about, because I'm an old school Marxist, like as a European, whatever. But, for me, Marxism was always primarily just an elaboration of the central contradiction of capitalism. That's Marxism, like, with very little about anything else, like about what the future looks like. It's primarily not only showing the various contradictions within capitalism, but the symptom as well, not just the symptoms, but the central contradiction of, for me, surplus value, like that it sits at the heart of capitalism, that if you untie that central contradiction, you untie capitalism itself. And that's all for me. That's what Marxism is. That's
no, it's true. I think the Marxism of Goldman is the Marxism of Lukács, for which it's not that, it's actually the standpoint of the proletariat. So Marxism is revolutionary, and what Marxism is about, even say what you're talking about of Marx's exposition of capital and its primary symptoms, is only to be understood as the best weapon for the cause of a proletarian. So for me, Marxism is about the kind of organization of a revolutionary strategy coming out of Lenin and things like that, right? So I think that Marxism after Lenin fundamentally changes in a certain way, and that if we reduce Marxism purely to a value form analysis, we end up actually as scholastic Marxists, and we're just sort of, pontificating as academics. I think actually rather Marxism needs to figure out the problem of its own worldview. And Lacan can help us in that regard.
Yep.
In other words, how do we build a sense of Marxism as, well, actually, Goldman thought of Marxism as a faith, and he thought that the wager was a secular faith, and that Marxism, because you see, there's the whole Pelagian controversy, which we didn't mention, behind the scenes here. And Goldman thinks that Marxism is the modern Pelagian heresy, and that the proletariat is the heretical force in society. So Marxism as a heresy is an interesting way to think about it, as a kind of activated how do you activate something to change the social relations? I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of these value form Marxists miss out on the social dimension of what Marx is materialism in a certain way, and they end up very textual, very scholastic, and so on.
Mhm.
So I find myself more and more convinced by Lukács. I don't know if that contradicts what you just said, by the way.
Yeah, no,
It
no,
may
that's
not.
very interesting. No, I would like to pick your brains more on it, but I also understand that will take us off on a different tangent. So I'll let you get back on track, but I appreciate you sharing that.
Okay,
Yep.
let's do this. We have several guests with us, and thanks everybody for watching this conversation. We have about a half an hour left. I'm gonna bring folks in who have questions, and we will say hello to our comrades here. Greetings, everybody.
And I noticed quite a few people wrote their questions in the chat box as well. So
Yeah, but I'd also welcome folks. I mean, to read if they wish, or to get on video as you wish. I can read them. First, we have Akshay. Akshay, would you like me to just read it to Peter? Not sure if your video is working. It might not be. So I'll read it. Akshay asks, it's striking, Peter, that Kant, in Kant, the good is turned into a law that is the basis of the good that has to be then categorized, rather than a good that is the basis of the law as virtue. And in connection, the notion of a time out of joint, like the Hamlet idea, a time no longer ordered by good, but by law, God as law, like legal, where there is perhaps a stark difference between Augustine and Kant in understanding of law and temporality. So I'm not sure if that's a question in there or more of a kind of general comment. Perhaps Akshay could elaborate.
Comment. Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment. Yeah.
Go ahead if you are on audio.
No, I think we've lost them.
Okay.
But that's a good comment. I let that stand. I always careful. You don't have to answer a question that's not being asked, because we can all just talk forever when you've got a microphone in front of you. I'll try not to.
Yeah. So let's go then to Chris. Chris has several questions. I invite you to jump in, Chris.
Yeah, so I was having this sort of conversation with myself this morning about God creating the universe, and then the question sort of arises, does God create their own lack, right, if they're creating everything? And so my question is, this relates to Lacan's notion of grace as being the desire of the other. And so then asking yourselves, if you're in Pascal's position, devising this game, asking the question, what does God want if God's the other's desire? And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And I wrote the question above as well in the chat if you want to reference that. So does this kind of question of what do we make of grace and Lacan if God creates their own lack, and knowing also that God doesn't play the wager, asking the question for Pascal, what does God want in that sense? Thanks.
Oh, great. I mean, like, in a very simple answer, I tend to think of God as the signifier for lack. That's how I kind of like. This is what I think is radical theology, is that God, and then Christ is the signifier of the lack in the big other. But in a sense, it's very speculative that we get into this, but this idea that I mentioned with Gödel is that if there is, in a sense, a non-totalizable kind of non-deterministic heart within everything, and that's what I call God. Yeah, so I don't. That's what for me the signifier God is, and the reason why I use the signifier God is because, in a sense, it's eternal, it's omniscient, it's kind of omnipresent. It's kind of like, it fits with many of the traditional definitions of what God is, but I don't know. And then I say Christ, for me, is the name or the signifier of the lack in the big other. So Christ is, for me, the privileged kind of signifier that expresses in religious form the idea of the asymmetry that is at the heart of everything. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's just going like it's almost like, God doesn't create God's own lack, but in one sense, I would be saying, well, God is the name for the lack as such. But I don't know if that answers anything. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, no, that was very helpful. That actually helps clarify, because Peter's written so much, and you're such a wealth of what I love about your work, Peter, is that you bring a whole vocabulary of like distinct ways of thinking about these very essential categories. And I like also the fact that you don't call yourself a theologian; you're a philosopher. That's very interesting choice.
Yeah.
But that was very helpful, and I want to now turn to we have about 17 minutes left before we will close. But Greg has several points to raise. Please.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
First question: does your concept of communion play a role in the experience of grace?
Yes, that's a very good question. I have to think very fast. I'm also kind of like, I say, because I was immersing myself in Seminar 16 for this, I'm trying to put that out of my head for a second and go back to the way I think of grace, and in terms of this idea of a radical space in which you accept that you're accepted. My example often is AA. And the reason why I use AA is there's the 12 steps, but there's actually step 0. And step 0 is you're in a room full of people who just accept you for who you are. And eventually you're able to say, it might take you weeks or months, but eventually you're able to say, oh, my name is Peter and I'm an alcoholic, in a room full of people who don't actually ask you to change or do anything at all. That for me is you're in a communion where, because everyone is kind of marked by a similar trauma, similar lack around alcohol. So it's shaped around alcohol, but whether you're rich or poor, Republican or Democrat or this or that, in that circle, you are joined together by a shared trauma. And you experience this radical grace. And then what I would say is it's actually once you're able to internalize that experience of grace in that communion that you're actually able to change. So the 12 steps become effective, but only in so much as they are based upon this experience of grace. So that's how I connect communion and grace, very briefly.
Thank you.
So sorry, one quick so you're saying that the 0 point is kind of like the less than nothing, and that is the formation of the community, that you begin at this point as a kind of negative universal hinge point that forms the commonality of the group. Is that kind of one way to summarize it?
Yes, absolutely. And so in with AA, it's the trauma that's happened, the historical trauma has happened to you, alcohol. But what I'm interested in is the trauma that is being human. So you go to psychoanalysis because of your historical contingent traumas, but you go to the priest of the radical theology because of the universal trauma that is being a subject of lack.
Okay, great. Greg, did you have one follow-up, I think?
Yes. Another question. You know, when we think about grace, it's almost always saving grace. You know, there's a sort of supernatural divine intervention that's unwarranted. Is there any aspect of salvation in your conception of grace?
Yeah, so like I think of it as I would use the term salvatory or emancipatory or the cure. And what I mean by that is a different mode of being, that when you go to, say, Church of the Contradiction, right? This idea of you go to a liturgy, and in this liturgy, through the music and the art and the spoken word, you confront a divided absolute. You confront the reality that everything is divided, that there's no alternative world of wholeness and completeness. Your alienation is redoubled in reality. So it's not just that I am alienated, but that alienation is within everything. And for me, that changes your mode of being. Like literally, it transforms how you interact with the world and the people around you. And very briefly, this is from Todd McGowan's early book on The End of Dissatisfaction. If we talk about 3 types of God very quickly, the feudal God, like the Freudian primal father, an undivided God but everybody else is divided. We're all in this village together. Nobody can have their Bugatti or whatever. You know, we're all pretty much going to live and die together. That creates a lot of social solidarity. There's one undivided other, the Lord or God or whatever, and then the rest of us are castrated. Then there's the God of the demand to enjoy, which is the modern God. I would say this is the God that we're living today, which is that you're not divided. If you are, it's contingent. You can be all that you can be, optimize, seize the day, life hack, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then that creates all sorts of problems. And actually people want to go back to the God of the feudalism. Then the third God is the God who is also divided. You're castrated and so is God. That is the God of radical theology, is the castrated God. And I think there's a salvatory dimension to encountering castration as an ontological reality.
Wow.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Noah, would you mind jumping in, please?
Yeah. So the problem that I keep encountering with Pascal's wager is that it's really difficult for me to see a difference in the term God and the non-existence of a God. So I can't. What is the difference between God and non-God? Because if I choose to live, like, what's the difference between me or I living towards the dictates of myself and I living towards the dictates of God? Because the problem that I keep hitting is that a subject who's able to identify themselves as I is the problem. Like that's the wall that I keep hitting, is that the fact that I'm able to even perceive myself is the hardest part, because I think you mentioned something about then it draws into question whether or not the I exists. And because it's either God or an absence of God, but like the absence of God is a shadow of what was once a God. And like you said, like with the use of the signifier God, like the way that I'm thinking of it is that the signifier God is a type of like a residue or a leftover that that we have to tarry with.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, what do you like if I rephrase the question as to wager in the existing God or wager in the non-God? What's the difference? Or am I just messing up the question?
No, there's so much in there. I'd love to hear, potentially Daniel will jump in as well, because especially that question of the I haven't quite got what Lacan is doing with that dimension yet, but I'll answer what I think you're saying, or I'll throw something into the mix. In that, well, the way, and this is what I think Lacan does really interesting with this, is if we think of the Pascalian wager, as I say, as an encounter, as a sublimation of our encounter with the first other, say the mother other, and with the mother other's desire, so das Ding. So what Lacan is really expressing in sublimated form is that encounter with the absence of the other that is felt as a presence. So the desire of the other is a radical absence that draws out a question, and where do we fit within that question? That for me is what the hidden God is. It's like the universe has this gaze that we can't, that doesn't have any substance to it, that we feel. And the very point of the Lacanian wager, the Lacanian wager, is precisely to do the opposite of Pascal. That's exactly what we have to resist, becoming an instrument for and fantasizing how we can somehow answer the question of the other's desire. So we have to kind of like, so, you know, I think Lacan sets himself up against Pascal, but ultimately it's das Ding. It's, I think it's the idea that it's whenever even Lacan talks about what that, the can that looks back at him, there's something in everything that there's a crack. And Pascal's God is the experience of a type of gaze that disrupts and disorients us, but has no presence. But come back, no, is that related at all to what you're talking about, or?
You know, I'm honestly, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
I just keep tripping up on that. To even formulate this wager or this question, there has to be a perception of the I, and that is like, that is the big tripping block.
Because I think the point with the I has to do with Lacan's notion of speech. Remember, what's the first thing Lacan writes on the board is psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech. And he wants to say that the instantiation prior to the subject coming in and asking the question, who am I? Or even who is God, or any question for that matter. What is the constitution of the I? There's a prior, remember the point that Lacan repeats over and over and over. Pascal's entire notion of the wager is premised on the notion that the subject is already embarked. What does that mean? It means they're already inducted into a discourse. It is that discourse that already inducts them. That's the notion of the other with the capital O, right? And I think in that sense, what the name of the Father has to do with, because, you know, there is this notion that Pascal, and Adrian Johnson develops this pretty nicely, is that why Pascal is the inventor of the object A, he's also the inventor of what Lacan calls a paternalist solution to the crisis of the textual basis of God's omniscience, or God's verifiability, or God's, is like the whole problem of the crisis of science, the rise of capitalism, and so on, is a crisis of the Old Testament God, the basis of which was the sacrosanct basis of the word of the text. And so he has this point about writing as prior to speech, which is an old debate that he had with Derrida. You know, it's writing, what's more primary? And Lacan is making the point that writing is more primary, and that Pascal, in a sense, even though he doesn't even mention the Holy Father and the Holy Fathers of the book, he wants to say that kind of that's what's at stake in Pascal's wager, is the preservation of that old God of the real, which is found in writing. And that the question, therefore, is a secondary level question about the existence of the I within that discourse from which we are all already embarked. That's my understanding of it. Perhaps Peter could add to that, but that's my understanding of it.
Oh no, that's very helpful, because to be honest, like when I was reading, that's one of the bits that I struggled with most, and still I'm wrestling with. So yeah.
No, it's good. So like all things in Lacan, there's a certain suspension of one's own intellectual humility that he forces on you. Now, a lot of critics of Lacan will say he's doing that because he's charlatan and so on and so forth. No. I don't think, actually, I think it's a healthy question of keeping one in a state of unknowing itself.
Yes.
That's why I love reading Lacan.
Yeah, it's a joy of reading Lacan. I get bored of anyone I can understand, so I never get bored of Lacan.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. You can speak about Lacan with not understanding all. And I would even say the people who claim to know all of Lacan, I'm always suspicious of them.
Yes.
Okay, Akshay, for our final question, please, my friend, jump in.
I'm sorry, yeah. I mean, I hope I'm audible now, but the comment I put like way at the beginning of the talk, I think when you were mentioning sort of the mystic conception of God as sort of being non-conceptualizable. And I mean, I don't know, I was thinking sort of about when you were talking about enjoyment and temporality and sort of what's changing in that sense of time and how we're enjoying and how we wager. And, in particular, I guess like one parallel that I was sort of struck by that I wanted to kind of bring up was the, like in Hegel or in science fiction, like the future is similarly sort of non-conceptualizable, because whatever we say about the future is obviously from sort of our historical moment and a symptom of it. And I mean, you know, with Marx, I guess there's a certain break from that where, I mean, I don't know if it's a break, but a different kind of wager is made than the sort that, say, Hegel makes. So I don't know. I mean, I was interested in that question of prediction and sort of the dimension of the future, or I guess like what sort of changes both with Pascal's wager and with like the kind of Hegelian Marxist wager on the future, the possibility of a future, and what we can say about it. Yeah, that's about it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I that's very well said. I often talk of myself as an apocalypticist, rather than like a, you know, like people talk about progressive politics or whatever. Progressive always seems to imply exactly what you're saying, which is you kind of know where history's going, and you're hopefully on the right side of that history. But I live in Northern Ireland, where we had a 30-year war, and eventually we had the peace process and a thing called the Good Friday Agreement. And that was an apocalyptic event in that all parties had to give up their vision of what the future looked like. The paramilitaries, the governments, and had to get together and sit down, not out of a moral imperative, more so just like we're all going to destroy each other. This whole society is going to collapse. And out of this debate and out of this ability to not know what the future is, but rather to know that the contradictions and the violence in the present were becoming so unsustainable that things were going to collapse. That contradiction was raised to such a high level that something had to change, something had to erupt, and new things arose. I mean, the idea that we disbanded our entire police force. The RUC was the police force, and we created a new police force, the PSNI, and lots of other things. And we're in this weird transitionary space between we're Irish and we're British, and now we're in the EU and we're in the UK. So all of these possibilities. But I very strongly drawn to the Hegelian notion and the Kierkegaardian notion is that that to be very wary of thinking that we know the future. And rather, it's about drawing out the contradictions in the present. But I just think I'm echoing what you're saying in some respects. Unless you disagree with that, and then please disagree.
That wasn't. I'm also. Yeah, I mean, I realize I didn't frame that in a particularly concise way, but no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, Peter, I want to thank everybody for jumping in. I think we're going to bring this to a close. It's a little bit later in the evening in Ireland right now. Peter, we'd love to extend an invitation to you to join us again. What I really like about what you're doing is obviously taking these kind of philosophical insights, and so much of your work is putting them into the form of stories, in the form of parables, in the form of something that people can sink their teeth into, who don't have the patience, maybe like we do, to read this insanely difficult material. But so kudos on all of your work. And can you tell us, maybe in closing, Peter, what you have on the horizon? What are you working on right now in terms of your writing? And, you know, what's of interest right now for you?
Yeah, so I took a long time off writing, and now I'm just writing a book. The working title is My Favorite Emptiness, on these ideas of kind of a fundamental contradiction. I'm working on something called a Church of the Contradiction, which are liturgical spaces that invite people into this experience of communion. And I'll be putting some stuff out on that. So those are the things that I'm kind of working on at the moment. I'm kind of excited, but I love what you are doing, because I say these are incredibly difficult texts. And so it's exciting that there are people who are doing the really difficult work of going through these texts. And I would love to join you again and potentially be part of conversations where you're doing these close readings, because I need them. And it's amazing that you can get this outside the university. That's what I love.
Yes.
This is people who are passionate about these subjects, reading these texts carefully. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in 2 days, we'll have Dominique Hoens, who is actually, I think he's published probably the most on Pascal and Lacan, and really, I mean, he knows this stuff like the back of his hand, you know. So we've benefited from a kind of comradely. I mean, the Lacanian community is very comradely insofar as a majority of them will come on and not ask for a fee or anything like that. They'll just do it, you know, for the love of the material, you know, and this kind of mutual pursuit that we have to I guess, you know, the presupposition being that Lacan is an essential figure of thought, is an essential figure. And I don't want to like say, oh, you know, he's something like that. No, I mean, there's many problems with Lacan, but reading Lacan has been probably the most intellectually rewarding labor that I've done. You know, I mean, I can't think of something more challenging.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Peter, but
yeah, no, absolutely. No, 100%.
Yeah. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All the best. We'll close here. Until next time, folks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.